Today's story is so raw and haunting it may leave you thinking long after it ends, unfolding in the harsh frontier of the Wild West, where snow buries tracks and the land shows no mercy. This is a world where one wrong step can mean death, and where strangers meet not by choice, but by destiny. It started with a shape half buried in the snow, a moment easy to ignore, yet impossible to walk away from once seen. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Single Rancher found two Apache sisters freezing in the snow. Now they both want to be his wives. Before we step into this story, remember to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm had already taken control by the time Thorn Ashby reached the far stretch of the north fence. The sky pressed low, flat and colorless, a dull gray lid sealing the land beneath it. Each breath burned sharp inside his nose. Snow didn't fall gently here. It drove sideways, whipped hard by a wind that tore across the high country without obstruction, stacking drifts unevenly against stone, fence posts, and anything stubborn enough to remain upright. Thorn worked through it anyway. Winter didn't pause for comfort, and a broken fence meant scattered cattle once the thaw came. He moved with the discipline of a man who had learned what haste cost. Every pull of wire was deliberate. Every step tested before weight was committed, careful to avoid ice hidden beneath fresh powder. His left shoulder throbbed with the deep, familiar ache of an old injury that never truly healed. He adjusted his stance and said nothing more to himself about it. Pain was constant. It stayed whether you acknowledged it or not. There was a reason Thorn had come this far north. 3 years earlier, he had buried his wife Elspeth Ashby and their infant son Orrin Ashby during a fever outbreak. Afterward, he sold what little remained of his lower land and drove north, away from towns, away from people who talked too freely and remembered too much. Up here, his purpose was narrow and exact. Keep the ranch standing, keep the cattle alive, make it through winter without depending on anyone. The work consumed his days and left little room for thoughts better left sealed away. As he tightened the final length of wire, something near the base of the fence caught his eye, half lost beneath drifting snow. It didn't move, but it didn't belong there either. Thorn straightened slowly, tension setting into his frame before concern fully formed. He scanned the land by instinct, eyes tracing ridgelines and tree breaks, watching for riders or animals that might have tangled debris into his fence. There was nothing, only wind. He waited longer than necessary, listening, because experience had taught him that quick decisions rarely ended well. Then he moved closer. The shape resolved into two bodies collapsed against the fence post, positioned not in rest but in desperation. Two Apache women, identifiable by dress and features, though their clothing was torn thin, barely standing between skin and cold. Their hair was stiff with ice. Wrists and necks were exposed, skin cracked red from frost and wind. The older woman reacted first, eyes snapping open, alert despite exhaustion, locking onto Thorn the moment he entered her view. She tried to shift herself between him and the other woman, but the effort failed midway. Whatever strength she had left was nearly spent. The younger woman remained motionless, chest lifting shallowly, breath faint in the freezing air. A tightness settled in Thorn's chest that had nothing to do with the cold. Not panic. Not yet. Recognition. He had seen this line before. Not these women, but this condition, that narrow edge between survival and loss, and they were balanced on it. He didn't speak. His voice felt useless here. Instead, he pulled off his gloves, then his coat, exposing himself to the storm without pause. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, so the older woman could see his hands clearly. Her eyes tracked every movement, jaw set, ready for whatever followed. When he crouched, she flinched, but didn't strike. That told him enough. He wrapped his coat around the younger woman first. There was no argument to be made there, then shifted his footing and lifted both of them carefully, adjusting his balance when the older sister stiffened on instinct. She didn't fight. She couldn't. Thorn registered it without judgment, only urgency. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than it was. Wind sliced across his face. Snow crept down his collar. The weight in his arms pulled at muscles already worn from a full day's labor. He focused on each step, on steady breathing, forcing down the memory that tried to surface. The last time he'd carried someone like this, he'd arrived too late. The cabin stood firm against the storm. Low, solid, smoke trailing steady from the chimney. Inside, heat struck him at once. He shut the door with his foot, sealing the wind out. The interior was spare and purposeful. One table, 2 chairs, tools hung where they belonged. Nothing placed to impress, only to function. He set the women down near the hearth, easing them onto the floor where warmth could reach without overwhelming them. He stepped back immediately, giving space, then turned to the fire, feeding it wood until the flames responded. A kettle went on. Blankets were laid flat, not draped, and he waited. Only when the room shifted from cold to livable did he kneel again, checking hands and feet, noting stiffness, discoloration, the warning signs that demanded action without delay. The older sister watched him closely, eyes sharp despite fatigue, reading his intent through restraint rather than words. Thorn slid a tin cup of warmed broth across the floor within reach, then leaned back against the table, deliberately removing himself from their immediate space. The weight of the choice settled in him, heavy, but unmistakable. This was no longer just shelter from a storm. This would change the balance of his life, his routines, his isolation. Outside, the wind continued to hammer the cabin. Inside, the fire held steady. And Thorn understood with quiet certainty that whatever followed would not be undone by morning. He didn't sleep that night, not in any way that counted as rest. He stayed seated in the straight-backed chair near the wall, boots on, hands resting loosely on his thighs, listening to the cabin adjust to unfamiliar weight and breath. The fire burned steady. Logs popped softly as heat forced moisture free. Outside, the storm lost its fury, shifting from a roar to a grinding wind that pressed snow against the walls and roof. The older woman remained awake longer than he expected. Her eyes followed him whenever he moved, not with fear, but with the focus of someone who knew what happened when vigilance faded too soon. When Thorn added water to the kettle, she noticed. When he adjusted the blankets closer to the fire, she marked the distance he kept. Every decision registered, and his awareness of that made him more careful, not less. The younger sister stirred sometime after midnight, not fully awake, just a shallow movement. A low sound caught in her throat as her body reacted to warmth returning too quickly. Thorn Ashby rose immediately, not rushing toward her but closing the distance just enough to judge her condition without crowding. Her skin was warmer now, though uneven, and her breathing had deepened, still irregular. He recognized the signs. Exhaustion layered with illness, the kind that lingered even after cold loosened its grip. He poured a small measure of warm broth into a second cup and placed it within reach, then stepped back again, leaving the decision to the older sister. She hesitated only briefly before lifting it, supporting her sister's head with one arm while guiding the cup with the other. Thorn watched in silence, a quiet relief settling when the younger woman swallowed without choking. As the night stretched on, his thoughts turned toward morning. More blankets would be needed from storage. The southern trail would have to be checked for signs of movement or pursuit. His winter rationing would need adjustment. None of these considerations carried resentment. They arrived as necessary recalculations, the kind made when circumstances shifted and refusal was neither practical nor decent. When dawn finally reached the cabin, it came without color, light, pale, and cold through the frost-clouded window. Thorn rose stiffly, joints protesting, and fed the fire before stepping outside to survey the storm's damage. Snow lay heavy across the yard. Drifts pressed hard against the barn doors, fence lines nearly erased. The land looked altered, as if a line had been drawn between before and after. He cleared a narrow path back to the door, breath steady, attention fixed. When he returned inside, the older sister sat upright against the wall, posture rigid but controlled. She met his gaze without flinching. The younger woman slept again, faint color returning to her face. Thorn set a bowl of food on the table and gestured once toward it, an offer without instruction. The older woman stood carefully, testing her legs before crossing the room. She ate slowly, never turning her back to him, never rushing. When finished, she placed the bowl where he could reach it and spoke for the first time since he had found them, giving her name, Vea, and her sister's, Naira. Her voice steady despite the strain beneath it. Thorn listened, nodded once, and answered in kind, stating his name and nothing more. No explanations followed, no demands were made. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving a changed landscape. Inside, something quieter had begun. Nothing fragile or dramatic, but deliberate, shaped by caution, necessity, and the shared understanding that survival now depended on more than one person. By mid-morning, the cabin no longer felt like a temporary refuge, but a space under quiet negotiation. Every movement was measured as three people learned one another's limits without naming them. Thorn divided his time between essential work and careful observation. Leaving for too long carried risk. Hovering too closely threatened the balance forming. He chose tasks that kept him present without crowding. He mended a broken chair rung at the table, sharpened a blade near the window, let the sounds of routine signal that nothing sudden would happen here. Vea moved with controlled efficiency despite lingering weakness, adjusting blankets, shifting Naira's posture so her breathing remained even, her focus unwavering. She checked her sister's forehead with the back of her hand, then her pulse, her expression tightening briefly before settling again. Thorn noticed the pause and stored it away, not as alarm, but as information. He retrieved dried herbs from a small tin, placed them beside the kettle, and explained in few words how they were used for lingering chills, offering knowledge rather than instruction. Vea accepted them with a short nod, her eyes measuring not the herbs, but the restraint in his tone. Naira woke slowly this time, confusion giving way to awareness as she took in the room, the fire, the unfamiliar ceiling beams. Her breath caught, and Thorn felt the tension before it showed in her body. He stepped back at once, putting space between them, and spoke quietly, telling her where she was, that the storm had passed, that she was safe for the moment. His voice stayed level and unhurried, leaving her room to decide what to believe. Vea took Naira's hand, steadying her, and Naira's shoulders eased slightly. Trust not complete, but enough. Food followed once Naira could sit upright. Thorn prepared it deliberately, his back half turned, explaining only what mattered so nothing felt hidden. He set the bowl down and stepped away, watching from the corner of his vision as Naira ate carefully, each movement cautious, strength returning in uneven measures. When she finished, she surprised herself by standing without help, swaying once before finding balance. Vea's hand hovered near her elbow, ready but not interfering, and Thorn recognized the instinct to protect without diminishing. Later, Thorn stepped outside to check the perimeter, scanning the fence line where he had found them, noting how quickly the land erased signs of passage. Snow softened edges. Wind flattened stories. Whatever had driven the sisters here would not be easily traced, and that knowledge settled heavily. He reinforced a weak section of fence, marked the trail with fresh cuts only he would recognize, and returned with snow clinging to his boots and a decision forming quietly, unspoken, but no longer avoidable. Inside, Vea had moved Nira closer to the window, letting her feel daylight again. Naira watched the land with careful interest, absorbing the openness, the absence of threat. When Thorn entered, she met his eyes briefly and thanked him, her voice low, steadier than before. He acknowledged it with a nod, neither deflecting nor expanding the moment, allowing gratitude to exist without obligation. As the day wore on, they shared the cabin without friction. No one claimed space. No one tested boundaries. Thorn adjusted his routines, placing tools higher, shifting a stool closer to the fire. Small changes that spoke of accommodation rather than control. By evening, Naira's color had improved. Vea's posture softened just enough to suggest fatigue rather than vigilance, and Thorn understood that the storm itself had not been the true crossing point. The choice to remain careful, to stay present without pressure, was already shaping what this place might become. The fourth day arrived with a narrow break in the weather that altered the sound of the land before it changed its appearance. Wind still moved across the high country, but without its former force, and the cabin responded with subtle creaks and settling sounds Thorn had learned to read during years of living alone. Morning light entered through the window in a muted band, revealing dust in the air and the steady rise of warmth from the stove. The space felt occupied now. Not crowded, but changed in a way silence alone could not undo. Thorn rose early. He woke as he always did, but the reason had shifted. Before, rising early had been about routine and control, ensuring the day unfolded according to his design. Now there was calculation layered beneath it. How long he could be gone, what work could wait, which tasks required him to stay close. He didn't resent the change, but he felt its weight, the knowledge that his choices now reached beyond his own body. Thorn Ashby stepped outside with measured care, closing the door quietly behind him instead of letting it fall shut. Snow still covered most of the ground, its surface crusted hard in places, treacherous in others. He checked the barn first, making sure the latch hadn't frozen, then walked the shorter stretch of fence nearest the cabin. Each step was deliberate, not from fear of injury, but from the understanding that carelessness now carried consequences beyond himself. Inside, Vea was already awake. She stood near the table, posture straight despite lingering fatigue, studying the cabin's layout with an attention that went beyond curiosity. She noted where Thorn stored food, where tools were kept, how space opened and narrowed. It wasn't intrusion, it was evaluation. Survival demanded awareness, and she approached it with discipline. When Naira stirred on her bedding near the stove, Vea moved to her at once, offering support without urgency, her movements confident and restrained. Naira's strength had returned unevenly. Her legs held, her balance followed, but her breath still caught without warning, reminding her how close she had come to failing her own body. She didn't speak of it. Instead, she focused on grounding actions, folding a blanket, straightening the kettle, standing by the window to watch clouds drift slowly across open sky. Each small task was a quiet test, and each success loosened the tension she'd carried since waking in an unfamiliar place. When Thorn returned, he brought in a bundle of split wood and set it down without comment, his gaze flicking briefly to Naira's face to judge her condition. He saw the steadier color in her skin, the clearer focus in her eyes, and allowed himself a moment of private relief that never reached his expression. He asked one practical question, whether the heat needed adjusting, then moved on, honoring the balance that had formed without pressing it. Breakfast came together without discussion. Thorn prepared the base. Vea added what she recognized from her own knowledge. Nira handled what her strength allowed. No one claimed authority. No one deferred without reason. The exchange stayed functional, shaped by observation rather than instruction. When Nira overreached once, lifting a pot too heavy for her, Thorn intervened quickly but without alarm, taking the weight and setting it down before stepping away again, as if nothing notable had happened. Nira took the gesture not as correction, but as support offered without judgment. Later, Vea approached Thorn directly. Her voice was calm, her words carefully chosen as she explained where they had come from and why the road behind them was no longer an option. She spoke of separation, of pressure from more than one direction, of choices made under threat that had narrowed their future to survival alone. She didn't ask for protection. She didn't plead. She stated facts and watched his response. Thorn listened without interrupting, his expression steady, though inside he felt the familiar tightening that came whenever the outside world pressed too close to the life he had kept contained. He weighed the risks of sheltering anyone in a place that valued isolation and punished difference. He also understood the cost of turning them away. The image of two figures frozen near his fence didn't fade. It didn't need to. He answered with clarity, not comfort. He spoke of the land's remoteness, the limits of what he could promise, the reality that staying meant work, patience, and exposure to hardship without assurance of safety. He didn't soften it. He didn't dress it up. Vea accepted this with a nod. Her respect for honesty showed in the way her shoulders settled instead of tightening. The afternoon moved slowly. Nira rested when her body required it, no longer forcing herself past limits out of fear of becoming a burden. Vea stepped outside briefly, standing near the edge of the cleared path, scanning the distance with a posture shaped by years of vigilance. Thorn watched from the doorway, noticing how she placed herself instinctively between open land and the cabin. The gesture did not go unseen. As evening drew near, the cabin filled with the scent of cooked food and warm wood, a change that marked time more clearly than any clock. They ate together, not ceremonially, but with intention, sharing space without crowding it. Conversation remained sparse, yet the quiet no longer felt evasive. It felt earned. When night settled in, Thorn secured the doors and windows as he always had, but his awareness stayed outward, tuned to the unfamiliar rhythm of other breaths in the room. He returned to his place near the wall, not from fear, but from habit. Vea stayed awake longer, her vigilance easing only after Nira slept deeply. The day ended without resolution, without promises spoken aloud. Still, something essential had shifted. The cabin was no longer defined by isolation alone. It had become a point of convergence, shaped by shared presence, measured choices, and the unspoken understanding that whatever came next would demand all three of them remain deliberate, grounded, and unwilling to retreat from what had already begun. The fifth morning arrived without gentleness. The air held a sharp clarity that carried sound farther than usual, and Thorn noticed it the moment he stepped outside, the way distant movement felt closer when the land fell quiet after days of weather. The sky had cleared overnight, leaving the mountains stark and exposed against the horizon. Every ridge stood visible, every shadow clean-edged. This was the kind of morning that demanded attention, the sort that made small mistakes visible and larger ones costly. Thorn lingered on the porch longer than usual, scanning the lower slopes and narrow cuts between trees, where a rider could pass unseen until it was too late. He wasn't expecting trouble, but expectation mattered little. Preparation mattered more. He studied the snow for disturbances, reading wind patterns, noting how drift lines had shifted since the night before. No clear tracks, no fresh signs of passage. Still, the unease refused to leave him. Inside the cabin, Vea sensed the shift before Thorn Ashby spoke a word. She had learned to read the land long before coming here, and this kind of stillness carried meaning. She stood near the doorway when Thorn stepped back inside, watching his face rather than asking questions. Naira remained by the stove, seated but alert, her recovery steady enough now that her awareness extended beyond her own body. Thorn explained what the morning suggested, choosing his words carefully, precise about what it meant. Visibility. Visibility created opportunity, for good or for harm. He didn't dramatize it, but he didn't soften it either. Vea absorbed the information, nodding once, her posture tightening not with fear, but with readiness. Naira listened closely, her gaze drifting toward the window as she grasped the reality that safety was never fixed, even here. The day's work adjusted around that truth. Thorn chose tasks that kept him within sight of the cabin, repairing tack near the barn, reinforcing a gate hinge thinned by winter wear. Vea joined him outside for the first time since the storm, testing her strength in measured steps, her eyes sweeping the terrain without pause. She didn't ask permission. She simply took position beside him, deliberate and alert. They worked side by side without coordination, each understanding the role the other filled. Thorn noticed how Vea positioned herself slightly uphill when she paused, granting herself a wider view. He noted how she kept her hands free, never fully occupied, ready to respond. In turn, she observed his efficiency, the absence of wasted motion, the way his attention never left the land, even while focused on his hands. The assessment between them unfolded without a single word. By midday, Naira ventured outside as well, bundled in layers, her movements slower but confident enough for short distances. She stayed close to the cabin wall, grounding herself by brushing her fingers along the rough wood as she walked. Her eyes remained fixed on the open space beyond. Thorn saw that her breathing stayed even and allowed himself to continue working without hovering, trusting her judgment while staying within reach. It was Naira who noticed it first, a flicker along the far ridge, barely visible against the rock, but wrong enough to catch her attention. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She spoke Vea's name softly, controlled, and pointed. Thorn followed her line of sight at once. Narrowing his eyes, he saw what she meant. Not riders, not clearly, but movement that suggested possibility rather than certainty. A familiar tightness settled in his chest, the part of him that remembered how quickly distance could collapse. He didn't reach for his rifle. Not yet. Instead, he measured angles, timing, lines of sight. He told both sisters to go back inside, not urgently but firmly, his voice leaving no room for debate. Vea complied immediately, positioning herself slightly behind Naira as they moved, her protective instinct fully engaged. Once they were inside, Thorn secured the door and shuttered the side facing the ridge, leaving the opposite side open enough for light, but not exposure. The next hour passed in focused stillness. Thorn stayed near the window, watching through narrow gaps, tracking the distant shape as it shifted and then vanished entirely. No approach followed. No confirmation of threat came. Still, the tension lingered, stretched thin across the room. When he finally stepped back, he explained what he had seen, and what he hadn't, laying out the uncertainty without exaggeration. Vea responded with context drawn from experience, explaining how danger often announced itself indirectly before taking form. Naira listened closely, absorbing every word, her expression serious now, the earlier softness replaced by focus. The conversation didn't spiral into fear. It settled into planning, where Naira should stay if something came, which routes offered escape, how sound carried differently in clear weather. Thorn didn't position himself as a commander. He offered what he knew and accepted what they brought in return. As evening fell and no further movement appeared, the tension eased without disappearing. Supper passed quieter than usual, each of them turning the day over privately. Thorn felt a shift inside himself that unsettled him more than the distant threat. He was no longer calculating risk for himself alone. Every decision now included two others, and that inclusion had already altered how he understood the land he once thought he knew completely. When night came, Thorn adjusted his routine again, placing his rifle within reach, but not in his hands, choosing vigilance over alarm. Vea took a position near the far wall, her awareness undimmed even as her body rested. Nira lay near the stove, eyes open longer than before, listening to the quiet with a new understanding of what it demanded. The day ended without incident, but it left behind a deeper awareness shared by all three. Safety here was real, but conditional. Trust had grown, but it now carried responsibility. And for the first time since coming north, Thorn admitted that the solitude he had built might not withstand what was taking shape within his walls, and that protecting it now meant protecting more than himself. The sixth day began with work that could no longer be delayed, the kind that marked the shift from emergency shelter to deliberate living. Thorn woke before first light, not from habit alone, but from the weight of decisions that had been settling quietly for days. The fire had burned low overnight, leaving the cabin cool but not cold, and the sound of two unfamiliar breaths registered immediately, not as intrusion, but as responsibility. He rebuilt the fire with practiced efficiency and stepped outside while the sky remained dark. The air was sharp enough to hone focus. Snow had receded further, exposing patches of hard earth and stone, and the cattle would need moving before the thaw softened the ground too much. Leaving the sisters alone for hours was no longer an option, he realized lightly. That thought alone told him how much had changed. When the cabin door opened again, Vea was already awake. She stood near the table, pulling on her boots, movements careful but assured. She met Thorn's eyes and waited. He explained his plan for the day, where he would be, how long he would be gone, the routes he would take, the signals he used if something went wrong. He spoke plainly, not to reassure, but to inform. Vea listened without interruption, absorbing every detail with the seriousness of someone who understood that knowledge itself was a form of safety. Naira emerged more slowly, wrapped in layers, her posture stronger than days before, though still measured. She listened from the edge of the room, committing every detail to memory, then asked a single precise question about what she should do if strangers appeared while Thorn Ashby was away. He answered honestly, offering options instead of orders, explaining where the terrain favored concealment and where it left no cover. Naira nodded once, satisfied, her confidence grounded in clarity rather than bravado. Before leaving, Thorn laid out tools and supplies within easy reach, making sure nothing essential would require searching. The gesture was quiet, almost unremarkable, but intentional. And Vea noticed it the moment he stepped outside. As the door closed behind him, a familiar tension tightened in his chest. Distance now carried consequences beyond his own exposure. The hours passed slowly. Vea kept watch from the window whenever her tasks allowed, her gaze tracing the same reference point Thorn had shown her, posture relaxed yet alert. Naira focused on smaller work inside the cabin, repairing a tear in one of Thorn's shirts with careful stitches, pausing often to rest her hands when fatigue crept in. Each task reinforced presence rather than obligation, a choice to contribute without erasing personal limits. Near midday, an unexpected sound cut across the open land. Hoofbeats, distant but unmistakable, carried clearly. Vea reacted instantly, guiding Nira toward the interior wall without urgency, signaling silence with a raised hand. The riders did not come close. They passed through a lower valley, visible only in brief flashes between trees before disappearing again. The moment ended without incident, but its weight remained. When Thorn returned later than expected, shoulders tight and expression drawn, Vea met him at the door and relayed what they had seen, her account precise and unemotional. Thorn listened carefully, nodding once, relief and concern settling together. He explained the delay, describing a calf that had strayed and the effort required to bring it back unharmed. His voice stayed even, but the fact that he offered an explanation at all marked another subtle shift. The afternoon turned toward preparation. Thorn reorganized storage, moving supplies into easier reach. He reinforced the latch on the back door, not because it had failed, but because redundancy mattered. Vea assisted without instruction, understanding the purpose behind each step through experience rather than explanation. Nira watched closely, absorbing patterns, learning what readiness looked like when fear wasn't the driving force. Later, as the sun dropped lower, Nira approached Thorn with quiet resolve and asked if she could walk the near perimeter under supervision, wanting to reacquaint herself with open ground. After brief consideration, Thorn agreed, setting clear boundaries and staying within sight. The walk was slow and deliberate, Nira testing her endurance one step at a time. Vea followed slightly behind, her watchful presence constant. Thorn observed without hovering, allowing the moment to unfold on Nira's terms. That evening, the cabin carried a different energy. Shared risk had sharpened awareness, but it had also strengthened something steadier. They ate together without tension, conversation minimal, functional, purposeful. Thorn noticed how Vea no longer placed herself fully between him and Nira, her stance shifting subtly as trust deepened. Nira spoke more freely now, not filling silence, but adding to it when she felt it mattered. As night settled in, Thorn chose not to take his usual place by the wall. Instead, he sat closer to the table, still alert, still prepared, but no longer isolating himself out of habit. Firelight cast steady shadows across the room, and the land outside lay quiet once more. The day closed with an understanding that went unspoken, but firmly set. Survival here would not be passive. It would demand planning, shared responsibility, and the willingness to adapt without surrendering dignity. Thorn recognized that whatever this arrangement became, it was no longer temporary, and he accepted the weight of that truth without resistance. The seventh day carried a different kind of tension, not from weather or distant movement, but from the slow realization that temporary measures had reached their limit. The cabin had adjusted to 3 people moving within it, but that balance now required definition. Silence remained, though no longer as caution alone. It had become a space where decisions waited. Thorn sensed it before anyone spoke. He saw it in the way Vea lingered longer than usual at the window, and how Nira remained by the table after finishing her work, palms resting flat on the wood as if grounding herself. Even the animals outside reacted to the shift, unsettled by nothing visible, responding instead to subtle changes in routine. Thorn recognized the signs. He had seen them before, not with people, but with land, when something approached a breaking point. It rarely announced itself loudly. He chose to address it before the day carried them further. After tending the morning fire and setting the cabin in order, he stepped outside briefly, scanning the perimeter. Not from fear, but to clear his thoughts. The land stayed quiet, open, exposed beneath a pale sky. It offered no answers, only space. When he returned, he closed the door carefully behind him and took a seat at the table instead of standing apart. Vea noticed at once. She straightened, posture alert but controlled, and waited. Naira looked between them, reading the change without explanation. Thorn did not begin with questions. He stated what was already true, that they had been here long enough for patterns to form. Staying without clarity, he said, would invite trouble later. Not necessarily from outside, but from uncertainty itself. His voice remained level, though the restraint behind it was clear. This was not a conversation he approached lightly. Vea answered first. She did not speak emotionally, nor did she soften her words. She explained that returning to the road was no longer an option, not from fear alone, but because fragmentation carried its own dangers. Traveling without cohesion meant exposure, constant threat, and loss of footing. Where she came from, shared survival meant more than convenience. It required commitment. Naira listened intently, her expression serious, earlier hesitation replaced by resolve, shaped through recovery and observation. Thorn absorbed their words without interruption. Inside him, opposing instincts pressed together, the pull toward control and predictability against the recognition that isolation had not healed him, only narrowed the world he lived in. He thought of the years he had spent containing grief through repetition, how routine had shielded him, but also held him in place. Quiet had kept him functioning, yet it had never allowed him to move forward. He understood now that letting them remain without defining what that meant would only recreate the same hollowness in a different shape. He asked one question, and only one. He needed to know whether they intended to stay when conditions turned against them, when the land demanded more than warmth and shelter, whether they would remain through hardship and uncertainty, without pulling away at the first sign of strain. It was not a challenge. It was a boundary. Naira answered without pause. Her voice was calm and steady, shaped by the certainty of someone who had already passed the point of retreat. She spoke of endurance not as an idea, but as something she had lived in her body and her mind. Vea followed, her words measured and firm, stating that any choice made with awareness carried responsibility. Neither asked Thorn Ashby for protection. What they offered instead was presence. The weight of their answers settled fully on him. The fear he had expected never came. In its place was something steadier. Thorn explained the realities of the land, the labor it required, the expectations it imposed, the limits of what he could provide. He promised no ease. What he offered was honesty and consistency, the same anchors that had carried him through loss. Vea accepted the terms without hesitation. Naira nodded, composed, her trust deliberate rather than blind. The rest of the day unfolded under that new understanding. Tasks were no longer provisional. Vea took charge of inventory, suggesting adjustments based on long-term survival. Naira reorganized the sleeping space with care for comfort and function. Never intrusive, always intentional. Thorn adjusted his work schedule, mapping the coming weeks with shared labor in mind. None of it was announced. The changes took shape naturally, driven by necessity rather than ceremony. As evening approached, the cabin reflected the shift. Tools rested where every hand could reach them. Food stores were redistributed for ease. Even the table felt altered. No longer a surface passed by, but a point of coordination. Conversation remained sparse, yet it no longer avoided what mattered. Every exchange carried purpose. When night settled in, Thorn did not withdraw to the edges out of habit. He stayed nearer the center of the room, alert, attentive, but no longer guarded. Vea allowed herself deeper rest, her vigilance easing gradually rather than falling away all at once. Naira slept soundly, her breathing even, uncertainty no longer keeping her awake. Outside, the land remained unchanged, indifferent to the decisions made within the cabin. Inside, something fundamental had been set in place. This was no longer a temporary convergence shaped by weather or chance. It was a deliberate alignment, chosen with full awareness of its cost. Thorn understood that what he had built in isolation was becoming something that demanded shared effort and shared risk, and for the first time since coming north, that realization did not feel like a threat. The 8th day arrived without announcement, yet everything about it felt intentional, as if the land itself had acknowledged the choice made the day before and adjusted accordingly. Morning light entered the cabin clean and steady, no longer filtered through storm or tension. The silence that greeted waking was no longer cautious. It was settled, shaped by routine taking hold again, this time with 3 people fully aware of their place within it. Thorn noticed the change first in himself. He moved through his morning work with focus that felt grounded rather than defensive, his attention no longer split between inward calculation and outward watchfulness. The fire was rebuilt, water set to heat, tools checked and returned to their places. These were no longer habits meant to contain grief. They were preparations meant to sustain continuity. Vea stepped into the day with purpose. Her hair was tied back tighter, her clothing adjusted for work rather than recovery, her posture reflecting readiness instead of endurance, without needing to ask. She joined Thorn outside, studying the land with an analytical eye, aware now that staying was no longer conditional. She asked practical questions about grazing routes, snowmelt, and where water pooled in early spring. Thorn answered plainly, appreciating the absence of assumption. She did not claim authority. She sought understanding. Nira remained inside at first, tending to tasks that required patience more than strength. She reorganized supplies with quiet precision, separating daily use from long-term stores, noting what would need repair before failure. Her movements were slower than Vea's, but more intentional than before, guided by awareness rather than fragility. She paused often, not from weakness, but to judge whether each action served a longer purpose. By late morning, Thorn made a choice that surprised even himself. He retrieved an unused ledger from the shelf, one he had kept only for cattle counts, and placed it on the table. Without ceremony, he began mapping the weeks ahead. Work to be done, areas needing attention, supplies that would require replenishment before travel became difficult again. He spoke as he worked, not issuing instructions, but allowing Vea and Nira to listen, to respond, to adjust. Vea pointed out vulnerabilities he had not considered, places where seasonal shifts could expose weakness. Nira suggested changes to food storage that would reduce waste and strain. Thorn weighed each contribution and incorporated them without resistance. There was no tension in the exchange. It worked because respect was already present. The afternoon turned toward shared labor beyond immediate need. Vea helped reinforce a secondary shelter near the barn, her movements confident, her judgment steady. Thorn showed her how the structure had been built to withstand wind rather than weight, explaining decisions he had made years earlier without expecting anyone else to inherit them. She took in the knowledge carefully, recognizing the trust it carried. Nira ventured farther outside than before, standing near the edge of the cleared path, testing her endurance step by step. Thorn watched without hovering, letting her set her own limits. When she rested, she did so without embarrassment, seated against a post, eyes fixed on the open land. She was no longer afraid of it. She was learning it. Late in the day, Thorn Ashby went to storage and brought out a small carved marker, a simple piece of wood he had once meant to set along the property line, then never had. He didn't explain why he'd kept it. He placed it in Vea's hands instead, and asked where she believed it belonged. She considered the question, weighing it, then pointed toward the trail that dropped away from the ridge, the place where choice first entered the land rather than retreat. Thorn accepted her judgment without comment. As evening settled, the cabin reflected the changes of the day. Space felt intentional. Tools and supplies rested where they made sense. Even the firelight seemed calmer, less restless. Supper came together not in the silence of caution, but in a quiet shaped by shared understanding. Conversation rose naturally. Short exchanges about work, weather, timing. Nothing forced, nothing avoided. When night arrived, it did so gently. Thorn secured the cabin by habit, not from expectation of danger. Vea rested without tension, her body no longer coiled for immediate response. Naira settled near the fire, her breathing even, her posture relaxed in a way that hadn't been possible days earlier. The 8th day ended without declaration or ceremony. Still, its meaning was unmistakable. The framework of a life had taken shape, not through promise or urgency, but through alignment. Each of them knew their place within it, not as compromise, but as choice proven by action. Outside, the land remained wide and indifferent, unchanged by what had been decided inside. Yet within the cabin, permanence began to feel real, not as an idea to test, but as something already underway, steady, intentional, no longer fragile. The 9th day arrived without tension, and that absence alone marked its weight. The land lay open and quiet beneath a pale sky. Snow had pulled back into darker patches of earth, the season turning in a way that suggested continuity rather than threat. Thorn woke with the sense that nothing required immediate correction, a rare feeling for a man long accustomed to constant adjustment. The cabin held steady warmth. The fire had banked clean through the night. Soft, even breathing filled the room, no longer sharp enough to pull him from sleep. He rose and moved with calm purpose, preparing the morning now with consideration beyond his own routine. Vea was already awake, seated at the table, reviewing the ledger they had begun together, her focus exact. Nira stirred near the stove soon after, stretching carefully, her strength returned enough that movement no longer required negotiation with pain. There was no hesitation, no guarded pause. She belonged here in a way that had become undeniable. They ate together without formality. Conversation stayed brief and practical, yet carried shared understanding. When the meal ended, Thorn cleared the table and remained standing, posture composed, expression thoughtful rather than burdened. He had spent the night settling intent, not rehearsing words. He didn't believe in speeches. He believed in clarity. He addressed both women directly, his voice steady, carrying choice rather than doubt. He spoke of the land and its demands, the work needed to keep it productive, the risks that came with staying this far from town. He didn't soften any of it. Then he spoke of commitment, not ownership, but permanence shaped by responsibility. He said plainly he would not ask them to remain under vague terms, nor allow their presence to stay undefined. What he offered was a shared life built on work, mutual protection, and respect that did not shift with circumstance. Vea listened without interrupting, her assessment complete before he finished. Nira watched Thorn closely, not seeking reassurance, but measuring the sincerity in his restraint. When he stopped, the room held silence. Light, expectant. Vea answered first, concise and firm, saying their choice had already been made through action, not impulse. She spoke of shared survival as binding, a decision that didn't require ceremony to hold meaning. Naira followed, calm and grounded, explaining that what she sought wasn't refuge, but belonging defined by contribution and trust. Neither hesitated. Neither qualified their words. Thorn accepted their answers with a single nod. The weight he'd carried since finding them near the fence eased fully for the first time. He went to the shelf and brought down 2 simple metal bands he had shaped years earlier during long winters, never intending to use them, never discarding them either. He set them on the table without flourish and said that if this path was chosen, it would be taken openly, without ambiguity. The moment that followed was quiet and resolved. Vea took one band, her grip steady. Naira took the other, her hand warm and sure. No vows were spoken. None were needed. Commitment had already been proven through days of consistent choice. The rest of the day unfolded with purpose rather than ritual. They worked together on tasks that pointed toward a future, not a temporary arrangement. A section of ground was cleared for expanded planting. Supplies were reorganized for long-term use. Plans were set without urgency, each decision reinforcing stability. As evening approached, the cabin filled with light that felt settled instead of fleeting. Supper was prepared and shared easily. A brief laugh surfaced when Naira misjudged a measure and corrected it without embarrassment. Vea spoke of changes needed for summer grazing. Thorn listened and added where needed, the exchange fluid and equal. When night came, the cabin was secured by habit, not fear. Thorn didn't withdraw to the edges. He stayed central, his presence no longer shaped by isolation. Vea rested without vigilance. Naira slept deeply, free of doubt. Outside, the land remained wide and demanding, indifferent to intention. Inside, something final had taken form. The cabin was no longer defined by solitude, rescue, or negotiation. It was defined by choice, clear and sustained through action. Thorn lay awake briefly, listening to the steady rhythm of shared breath, and understood with certainty that the life he had built to survive loss had expanded to hold something else entirely. Not replacement, not forgetting. Continuation. The future no longer felt uncertain. It felt established. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys shape us, and we hope this one left a mark on your heart. There are more paths ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption beneath the western sky. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts, and travel with us once again. Thank you, and God bless. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. The stories presented here are creative expressions and may mix historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. AI tools contribute to some elements of voice, imagery, and structure, but every published story is refined by editors and creators to ensure authentic emotional impact. We honor YouTube's policies and do not generate deceptive likenesses or artificial depictions of real people. All audiovisual components are legally licensed. Any use, redistribution, or alteration of this content must be granted through written consent. Your presence here means a lot. Thank you for supporting artistic storytelling.